and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to have you here. You have joined me for the fourth in the series on unlocking the power of brands within your organization. And today what we're going to do is talk about perception. So perception is a word that gets used an awful lot in branding, and for good reason. It's the right word to use, but as a result the actual psychology of perception is sometimes a little bit light, and it's a good opportunity for us today to dig into this, spend some time clarifying what perception really is. Perception, when it comes to brand, is pretty much the same thing. It's not necessarily reputation. It's not this universal belief about who you are. It's a very individual, personal experience. If you take nothing away from this talk today other than this, that an individual's perceptions are subject to that individual, and that becomes the brand, that's what you need to take away. The other thing to note is that perception isn't right or wrong. It's not logical, it's emotional, right? And so it's not about kind of, proving to somebody why you're the best. It's about emotional resonance that builds a positive perception. Think, for example, of dogs as a subject. When I was a kid, I'll let you in on a little story. I was chased by an Alsatian dog, and then I was bitten on the bum as I tried to run away, and only escaped with my life by jumping over a fence. That experience of dogs really shifted my perception of dogs, so that ever since then, I have been somewhat wary of dogs, particularly large dogs. Now, I have a very large dog at the moment, but he's incredibly friendly and I've got used to him. But that wasn't easy for me to get used to. My wife, on the other hand, grew up with dogs. So for her, dogs were part of what it meant to have a healthy, well-connected family. And as a result, it was very important that we got a dog to sort of build that sense of family and build that what it meant to kind of have safety and kind of a nurturing environment in the home, and the role that a dog played in that. So rather than each having our own perception of dogs based upon a kind of logical assent that we all kind of made, they were very individual and based upon our own personal experience. So if you break that down further, many different factors form and create perceptions, such as these three categories. The first one being beliefs, the second one being experiences, and the third one being knowledge. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through each of those briefly. Firstly, beliefs. What I think about the world or my worldview, as well as the culture that I come from and how that impacts and informs my perceptions. Secondly, experiences can influence perceptions. The things that have happened to me, for example, the dog biting me on the bum, the experience and coloured my perception of dogs generally. Lastly, knowledge can play a part in how we perceive. So how has information and learning informed my opinion of a given subject? Now that doesn't necessarily mean, sort of cerebral kind of educational knowledge. It can be the knowledge that we have from our kind of experience and learning generally in life. And so those three categories tend to be the ways that we develop our perceptions. Let's start digging in a little bit further. Several factors influence perception from a biological and psychological perspective. Perception is our ability to understand and navigate the world around us. And that again is why it is linked to trust and our ability to read our environment, deduce what is safe and unsafe about the world around us, and then navigate it in an advantageous and safe way. Our perceptions therefore play a critical role in our survival instinct. That is why perception is subjective. The ability to contextualize information about our environment based upon our experiences and what is readily in front of us then enables us to deduce what we should do about that stimuli and how we should process it and therefore critically act to enforce and enable our survival as humans. This process works based on this interrelationship between two things. So our external world and how we use our senses to map our environment, and secondly our inner world that enables us to interpret that information appropriately. That information comes, as I mentioned, through our senses, primarily through our vision, and then through our hearing and smell, touch and taste. Our senses then relay that kind of external stimuli that comes from the world to our brain. That is the way that our brain then digests information and interprets that information and puts it into the context based upon our experiences, our knowledge, and so on and so forth, and belief, and our understanding of the subject that we're being addressed with. Now, the challenge is that our neurological system manages our sensory intake. This is because the information from our minds gets filtered based upon priority. It does this to reduce the stress of our neurological system. So say, for example, you heard a nondescript bell at a low volume ringing in your ear in a quiet room. Your ability to identify that bell would be much higher than if you were, say, for example, listening to that bell in the middle of a busy airport. Everything is based upon context. If, for example, that bell was actually a fire alarm, even though your brain had heard it at a low volume at a distance, it would alert you to a much more serious nature about an alarm that was ringing in your ear to tell you about potential danger and draw your attention to it, even though the volume was the same. Your memory's ability to be able to process the information is critical in deducing and perceiving that information in an advantageous way. So this is important when placing into context of branding, because we are heavily overstimulated in this world. I think there's no question around that each person receives around 3,000 branded messages a day, sort of vying for our attention, trying to get our attention. So our ability to focus on a particular message is again dramatically reduced, which then speaks of the effectiveness of then creating marketing content, right? How you communicate with an audience is all based upon our ability to draw their attention to something that they need to perceive. Most of our ability to make sense of the world around us happens through our sight. Won't go into this in much depth now, but suffice to say that your brain has parallel processing information abilities. This is how it makes sense of all of the sort of visual aspects of multiple elements of what you see at any one time, taking into account details like colour and motion and form and depth, to identify what it is that we're looking at and how we should respond to it. So somebody running at you, or that dog running at me, for example, would have alerted my mind a lot more quickly, and my perceptions of that dog and whether or not it was a threat based upon its speed. So without perception, we cannot interpret the range of senses that help us to understand the importance of, say, for example, a mother's face, or the meaning it has to us, or the significance of the strange smell of gas that might come from a kitchen leak in our apartment. Perception ascribes meaning to things based upon our beliefs, experiences, and our knowledge and learnings. So even though our eyes are incredibly and wonderfully complex, they, like our nose, don't tell us what things mean. Our brain does that. Take, for example, this picture of a vase or a head. Depending upon how you perceive it, whether it's a vase or whether or not you see it's two heads talking to each other, will dictate how you perceive. This is where your perceptual set comes in. This addresses the psychological factors that determine how you make sense of the environment around you. If, for example, the vase that you saw had flowers in it, potentially the context would help you to interpret the picture more clearly and you'd see a vase. Maybe if you saw a speech bubble coming from it instead, you would think it's two people talking to each other. So how does this affect you? As somebody who's either responsible for a brand, or as somebody who works at an agency that is serving their clients with their brands, I can see that there is an excellent opportunity for you to interpret the stimuli around your product or service in the right way. It's essential to understand how your audience receives you first. This is because we are neurologically wired to ignore those issues that are of little interest or of low priority to us, and why we should focus on attention connecting to specific audiences to be as relevant as possible. So again, we're coming back to the fact that knowing your audience, knowing what's important to them as opposed to a different audience, is so fundamental to building strong brands that unless you do that, you're going to be irrelevant and continue to waste your investments in marketing. It's also crucial for you to understand that this process to building trust with your audiences, if for example you don't take into account the way that perceptions are built, and adjust your approach accordingly. So make sure, I would suggest, that you know your audience, you understand what's important to them, you understand how to create a resonance with them that ensures that they build a perception based upon their sensory information that stimulates their perceptions in the right way, in an advantageous way that is crucial to them. I want to encourage you moving forward that you should have a laser focus on who it is that you're trying to reach, so you can tailor your approach to specifically reach that person. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope this sort of whistle-stop tour around what perception is has been useful for you. Next week we're going to talk further about building strong brands and unlocking the potential of brand within your organisation. So please come back next week and do share this with anybody that you feel it would be relevant for. Hopefully, lifting the lid on these things is going to help you to have more clarity, be more efficient in reaching your audiences, and ultimately more effective. Thank you for your time. I'll see you next week. Bye.